Thanks everybody for joining us. Some last minute shuffling there. We had some technical problems, so I think we're all good to go. Hopefully there's no problems there. So we got 4 router jigs to improve accuracy, efficiency in a small shop. These are not, super high, ultra fancy, 100 part jigs. Most of them are really quite simple. But that's part of what I like about these jigs. They're really simple. They do a simple job really well, and that's kind of what working in a small shop is all about. And the router is such a multifunctional uh, uh, machine, right? By nature, right? And that's one of the reasons why they work so well, not only in a small shop, but also working with jigs. Jigs sort of boost their efficiency and their accuracy, um, especially once you start putting on things like template guides, these sorts of things. You get them all in different sizes, and they attach to the rudder base, and they follow a pattern, that sort of thing. You can get a lot of edge guides to help guide the routers. The ability to bolt a router's base to into a workpiece, a wooden panel of sorts, a jig. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. That also makes them really, really functional. And lastly, one thing that makes them really great and flexible in a small shop is the router bits that they can use, all sorts of manner of router bits. We're not going to get into that tonight, though. We're going to focus on attaching attaching the router to a jig, and first of all, making that jig, and to focus on that efficiency and accuracy. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction here about what a jig is, the benefits, some general tips on making jigs, and then we're going to go over the 4 jigs that I have for you here. And after each of the jigs, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A. So if you have any questions, pop them right into that chat bar. Chad and Carl are here. If they're really kind of simple, a sentence or 2 answer, they'll give you an answer. Otherwise, they'll fire them to me, and we can go over any sort of details, that sort of thing. So yeah, don't be shy. Ask questions. This is what this is all about. So what is a jig? You probably heard the term. It kind of hard to define really, but I would say a jig is a device used to guide a tool. It could be a drill bit, it could be a saw blade, it could be a router bit, and it's to perform a repetitive task with accuracy and consistency. Right? So essentially, a jig acts as a template or guide, sort of ensuring that cuts or holes or other features you cut into a piece are machined in sort of the right location and orientation, right? And they can be very simple or very complex, as I mentioned. So now, in terms of benefits of a jig, a jig improves repeatability. It's one of the great things with a jig. That allows you to make multiple parts that are the exactly same, or even not necessarily multiple parts, but multiple cuts or operations with consistent results that way. Jig also improves accuracy, allowing you to hone in on sort of an exact dimension or angle or that sort of thing. Jigs also help make some operations safer by using special clamp down devices, allowing you to properly secure the workpiece, whether you're running it through a table saw, using it with a router or whatnot, and to keep your hands a little bit far away, and to make sure that the operation goes off without any troubles. So, jig basics, right? You're always going to have this, balance of like quality and longevity versus, this simple jig that's made sort of cheaply and quickly. And really, I'm not going to say that either one of them is wrong. It all depends, right? If you think that you're going to use a jig for decades, I would strongly recommend you make it out of quality material. Use, use quality fasteners. Use, appropriate woodworking techniques to make that last. But if it's such a unique operation and you probably never use this jig again, there's really no reason to spend all kinds of time making a really fancy jig. As long as it's strong enough, as long as it's safe enough, as long as it'll get the job done, that's fine. I've made many jigs where I use, less, lower quality material, and I know it won't last a long time, but it's only for one or two really unique cuts, and that's that. Right? So that's always going to be up to you, right? It depends on the situation, but make a conscious effort that if it is going to be the sort of jig where you put on the wall and you go back to, every week, every month, even 2 or 3 times a year, it's worthwhile to make it last.
Rob,
Yep.
I don't think your microphone's on. I'm not sure if you.
The microphone is on. I can change.
I'm just not sure if anyone's having a hard time hearing you or not, but I want to just let you know.
Is anyone having trouble hearing me?
Nope, sounds like everybody's good. I just wanted to make sure because
Okay, good, because I've got
for you.
email here and everything looks good from my end.
Okay, sounds
But
good.
if there is a problem, I've got another microphone there
Perfect.
charged, ready to go.
Thanks.
So, where was I? So that wraps up our talk about jigs. No, just so. So we're talking about sheet goods. Right away, you're probably going to be dealing with sheet goods if you're making a jig, right? So you've got a few options. You've got plywood. Even within plywood, you have a quality Baltic birch versus lower quality spruce ply, that sort of thing. You've got particle board, maybe a melamine surface as well to deal with on particle board, and you've got MDF. So I won't go heavily into the pros and cons of each, but I did write an article about a year or so that we can share about the pros and cons of all these materials. But if a jig needs to be very flat, I would tend to stay away from plywood. Plywood has a tendency to warp a little bit. MDF stays nice and flat. This is melamine. You can't quite see the edge, but it's a 3/4 inch particle board with melamine surface. It stays quite flat. Even if it's a particle core with no melamine surface, it tends to stay quite flat. So another thing is sort of its strength, right? Plywood is going to be a lot stronger. It may be a little bit more lasting than the other two. Screw holding ability might be an issue for some jigs. If you really need to hold some sort of a clamp, yeah, something like these hold downs, and you're wanting to put a fair bit of pressure on them to keep a workpiece in place, you're going to have to screw this down to the jig, and that's where screw holding power will come into play. Plywood is generally a lot better than particle board or MDF, though the last two can more easily chip out. So again, it's sort of a choose your own adventure, right? Every situation is different. Solid wood can also be considered, but I would usually use it as some sort of stop to butt wood against, or maybe if it's a jig that's really going to be getting a fair bit of use, I would use it as some sort of a stop, like a fence, possibly even to wrap piece the jig base in solid edging, just to, if you did drop it, it will protect it a bit more, that sort of thing. So all of these things kind of come into play. Every time it's going to be a little bit different, and uh, you know also jig hardware. Some different stops, hold down devices. You can get really nice ones. You can also spend a lot of money on these things too. So if you need that, and if it will boost the long-term performance, I would definitely recommend it. Otherwise, you don't necessarily need those things, right? So that's a really quick overview of some, what is a jig? What are the benefits? Talk about some of the materials you use with them. And that's not just applying to routers. That's applying to jigs for your table saw, jigs for pretty much anything, really. Um, Now, because we are dealing with routers here, we have to go over a really important rule for routers. Um, if you were with us with a few of the router webinars I did, you would have heard me say something along the lines of uh, make don't take too much material off with one pass. That's one of the biggest things with a router. Even though you can have really large bits, fairly large bit there, and it could take off quite a bit of material. And if you're machining some hardened maple or something like that, that's going to generate a lot of force, and you're going to probably have some sort of problems, whether that's safety issue, or kickback, or whether you have a poor machine surface. It's going to stress your machine quite a bit. Always take multiple passes unless you're taking a very, unless all you need to do is take a small pass. So that's the one thing that I find new woodworkers especially want to do. Want to set it up to full height, machine it in one pass. Should be no problem, right? Very rarely is that the case, right? So if you're machining a groove, multiple passes. If you're machining edge treatment without a jig, multiple passes as well to sneak up on that final that final pass that you want, right? So always keep that one in mind. So let's get into the jigs then. First one, this actually isn't it, but it's a good starting point to introduce what my first one is. This is just a simple jig, a straight edge. You can see I've got a couple of arrows on it, implying that this edge is the straight edge. Just a 1/2 inch piece of furniture grade plywood. I've also applied a couple coats of shellac to this edge, sanded them out so it's lower friction, wax that edge as well, give it less friction as well. This is just a straight edge. It guides your router in a straight line. So I can clean up it right there. I could run my router along there, and I'd have, depending on the bit I used, I'd have maybe a square bottom groove. I could have a sliding dovetail. I could put a very shallow, very narrow groove in there and inlay some string banding, something like that. All kinds of options depending on the bit you're using. I'm not going to say that's one of the four because it's really simple, but there are other ways that we can take this and make it a little bit more useful, helpful, right? So although I've never made one thing you could do is, if you can imagine clamping this down, then you rest your base of your router against that edge and move it along. The only tricky part is that you have to offset this from where you want the cut. Some people, if they're using, I should back up for a second. I want to mention one thing. I counted the other day, earlier today, I've got 13 routers. I'm not trying to brag. It's just, you actually run into some sort of challenges because each of the base footprints are different distances across, right? I have trim routers that are probably 3.5, 4 inches. I have these larger routers that are quite large. And so I can't really set this a certain distance from the edge, and because depends on what router I use, right? So some people, when they deal with the same router, they will cut a piece of wood the exact distance from the edge of the base to the edge of the bit. Now even fasten it with a, doesn't have to be a piano hinge, it can be any sort of, couple, 2 or 3 hinges along here, so that if they know they want their dado or whatever joint to be from here to here, they can pull down that piece, align that piece right up with those lines, hinge it back, and then you're left with this this edge that will give you the proper offset. Right? Pretty simple, but because I have so many routers and so many different bits, so many different sort of styles of operations I'm using, it's never really been something that's appealed to me too much. If I do need something like this, I just measure over. This doesn't even matter how the diameter of the bit or what base I'm using. I just make the measurement. Oh, that's 2 7/8. I offset it by 2 7/8 on the other side, clamp it down, and run my groove. So that's a bit of preliminary. That's very, very, very simple jig, as you can see. But what I do find is that I'm often needing. So this is the first jig now. We're getting into it now. I often need a. It could be a dado. It could be a groove. It could be a dovetail groove for a sliding dovetail for some carcass work, that sort of thing. I need it 90 degrees across the piece. Maybe I'm attaching shelves to a gable, those sorts of things. So here you've got it. You've got this piece here. Both sides are parallel and straight, and it's attached to this cross piece at exactly 90 degrees. So if I was going to machine a cross grain groove in this panel, this is actually a work surface. So let's say this was a gable side. I could mark where I want the groove, and then there's 2 approaches here. When I'm using it, either I measure the offset and put a line over here where I need this to be and clamp it down right there, automatically 90 degrees. Or if I use the other side, I can tell from some of these lines, I've used them many times here, it's getting to be a little bit pointless because there are so many notches and grooves. But as soon as you make one notch across here, you can tell exactly where the cut is. So if you notch where you want the cut to be, you just line up the groove with your pencil mark, clamp it in place, and you're done. It's quite simple. But as I said, I have lots of different routers, many different excuse me, many different bits, many different types of joints I want to make. And sooner or later, I've got all sorts of different notches going, and I make some more. Got more notches, more types of operations that I'm doing with these. Some were even quite small because I was making a small cabinet, and this could only extend so far into the cavity because these were too long. So I just made a shorter one. They're really, it takes just a few minutes to make. And as you can see with this one, we have the piece that I run the router against and the main cross piece. But because I had to route such a deep sliding dovetail, there was only about a 1/16 of an inch of material left on. So I just added on a piece of spruce and kept it back from the edge a little bit. So this is the cross piece, and that's the piece that references against the edge to give me that 90-degree angle. in operation, it's really quite straightforward. I will clamp, depending on which side I'm routing on. I may clamp, add a clamp like so. I may even add a clamp out here just to ensure it stays square, and I'm ready to run the groove. Now, this is an important aspect of not only routing, but I find the router is it's the trickiest part. It's the trickiest power tool or machine to figure out when it comes to climb cutting or convention cutting, because you can move the router this way, or you can just as easily move the router this way. One's right, one's wrong. It could very well lead to breaking the bit, having the bit fly around the shop, ruining your workpiece. All sorts of things can go wrong, and you really don't, at 20,000 RPM, you don't want to be doing that. So basically, how I think of it in my mind is if you're looking directly at the fence and your router is in between you and the fence, you have to move the router from left to right. So that means if I'm over here and I've got everything clamped up and I'm routing on this side, I'm going to be machining in this direction. If I'm over here machining off the other side, I have the fence, I'm in front of the fence, router's in between me and the fence, I move it left to right. So hopefully the picture isn't reversed, because it will look as if I'm moving it to right from right to left each time. So hopefully that's not the case, but left to right, and that's so the rotation of the bit presses the base of the router into the side of this jig here while it's making that cut. Otherwise, if you do it the other way, the rotation of the bit will actually push the router away from the straight edge, and then you're freehand routing in no man's land, and the likelihood of that bit grabbing and jerking jerking itself through the material is going to be quite large. So like I said, as you're standing there looking at the fence, router between you and the fence, left to right. Now, one thing I should mention, this router, you'll see, is a good example. Some routers, the bases are perfectly round. This one is not, right? So you could align, you could take the measurement from here to the bit. You could also take it from the curved portion to the bit. They'll be different, and you just have to make sure that you run run the operation with whichever you take the measurement from. I tend to try to use the curved portion, because think about it. If you are on the straight portion and you even rotate the router slightly, all of a sudden that joint just shifted a little bit, right? But if you're on the curved part and as you're routing, you rotate the bit a little bit, in theory it should all be still in a straight line, right? If you really want to get technical, you may find that sometimes the distance from this curve to the bit is going to be different from this curve to the bit, because a base plate might be slightly off center or something like that. But as long as you're using the same side each time, they're at least going to be consistent, and you can check whether that's appropriate for the cuts that you're making. So let's maybe go over a few questions, if we have any, on this guy before we move away from questions, Jen?
Sorry, I wasn't able to get my mute that off. No, there were only a couple, and Carl was able to answer them, so we're good for now.
Sure. Okay, great. Let me put these guys away. Bit more room. Now, the last one, I'm going to move us over to my table saw. I had it set up with my tripod on my phone, which was going to be quite easy, but it didn't work. So we're going to shift gears slightly. I use a lot of curves in my work, and it's one of the things that elevates your work, right? Making straight 90-degree, straight cuts, straight edges, 90-degree angles, relatively simple. It's when you start putting a curve into the end of a desk, or gosh, there's thousands of ways that we could use curves, right? And they can just be even partial arcs. They don't have to be full circles or even half circles. But often people don't really know how to simply do a curve, right? You can take your bandsaw, you can cut it, but it's not going to be fantastically smooth and even. Right? A router equipped with it's over here, sorry. Equipped with a okay, I'll get another one off the shelf here. Luckily, I have 3 of these. So, sorry about that. That's probably about a 42-inch long jig to cut circles. As you can imagine, this is going to be pretty simple as well, right? Basically, you attach your router to one end. There's a hole in the center so the bit can go through, and you have, because I've used this many times, there's a series of holes that relate to how large the radius is, right? So the only tricky thing with this jig is, and I've messed this up as well, is how you set up that diameter. Sometimes you want an outside curve, essentially what this is. And if that's the case, once you have your rotor attached, you want to measure from the inside of the bit. Let's say you want to do a 24-inch radius curve. Measure from the inside of the bit, 24 inches out, drill a hole there, and that's where your screw goes down into the workpiece. But if what you want, don't have a good example of it, but let's say you had a desk with a slight curve in it, so you could sit slightly into the desk a little bit. That's an inside curve. So you would have to adjust the measuring so it was from the outside of the bit in. I've messed that up before. I'm sure I'll do it again. But sometimes what I do is you machine the plywood or particle board, the core with an inside radius, an outside radius, and then you machine solid wood edging in sections using the other approach, so you can machine the mating curve on their edges and apply them to that curved edge. And if you do it right, they'll fit perfectly. But if you don't account for that difference in the bit, there's going to be that gap in there. They won't fit. They won't fit quite right. So, we can take This is one I use for my trim router. As you can see, there's all kinds of holes in that. And sometimes when you only need a small radius, this is what, about 16 inches long. It's a lot easier to work with a smaller piece, right? Another time I needed to do something that was a little bit more unique. Also, small pieces, just probably 3/16 inch thick masonite. And you can see, I'll show you, a series of holes across. They're all about, I'm going to say about half an inch away from each other, all in a line. The reason why I did that was because once I had the bit set to the depth and the router in place, I used it to route. This is just a practice piece, but this is the piece that I routed. So I used the same center point, and I just got half an inch bigger every time, and you can see the depth there. So this was just a practice piece, but it was a larger piece, and I just wanted to make sure that that the increment that I was using was proper, because of the actual bit that I was using. It had a unique shape to it. It was only small, but I wanted the ups to meld right in with the downs, and so it was a wave like that. To be honest, that's a pretty unique technique or project, but it does let you sort of see what's possible, right? That's a really simple jig, and I just had one, slightly unique rotor bit, and it produced that for me. So with these guys, I find a half-inch thick piece is more than strong enough. Now, as you can imagine, let's say I'm going to bring back this work piece for a sec. Let's say I was cutting this into a curve on the end here. So basically what I would do is I would hopefully leave this large enough oversize so that I could actually screw this down to a work surface of sorts. And the part that I screw through is actually going to be waste. I'll cut it off later. Otherwise, you could clamp this down, but as you can imagine, when you're making the curve, you can't have a lot of stuff in the way, or else it will stop the travel of the circle jig. Right? So screwing it down, screwing an oversized piece down is definitely a lot easier. But as you can see here, let's pretend I'm only not installing the router because it's quite heavy and a little bit unwieldy. But you've got your router here, you've got your straight bit, and if I was to screw this right down to the surface, you can see we'd have a problem. So usually what I do is put a piece the same thickness, clamp it, screw it down, whatever it is, over the whatever diameter I need, so that everything is in that same plane. Right? And sometimes I even have to go to the extent, if I needed something longer than this, I would just simply add a longer section. I would screw it right to this with a medium amount of overlap. And I've done it before where you can even do a radius of over 8 feet long, as long as you have these joined well, because the longer you have this piece, the more flex it is. I think the longest I've ever done, I had to add another couple pieces of wood at an angle to form a triangle, and that helped keep everything a lot more structurally sound. But that's, that was a really unique job. I don't think that many of you will certainly not where you're going to be starting anyways, but that's, for a gradual shape in a dining table, something like that. It's still possible. You don't need a full CNC router or anything like that. It's still possible to do it with some very basic materials and tools, right? So, any questions on that?
Nope, not at this time.
Third one, I'm going to make some noise here and make some shavings. Let's see here. Got. I deal with a lot of veneering, and so your veneering cores, you're adding solid wood edging, that sort of thing. And the tricky thing, I just whipped this up this afternoon, but it's just a piece of 3/4 particle board with a couple of walnut edges. I just use walnut to have a contrasting color. But should show you the problem, or the challenge anyways. So when you put, this is 3/4 inch material, but maybe you put on a 7/8 inch wide solid edging, maybe even wider, and then you have to flush up that surface so you can potentially put the veneer right over top of it. Or even if the veneer is already there, you at least have to flush those two so it feels even. You can use a hand plane. If you got it really sharp and you have a really if you're really good with the hand plane, but I still find that more often than not, there's either a little bit of chipping, you dig into the core, something like that, and it's surprisingly easy to ruin it. So what you can do is use a really simple. I have different sizes and different shapes. It doesn't really matter too much. Here's a basic one. This was actually an offcut that I just cut to a shorter piece, and labeled it with what router it goes with. And what we're going to do here is we're going to remove the base plate of the router, and then add this little jig here to the base of the router. But we're not going to go past the bit when we install it. So the bit is going to be out on its own, so to speak. That, always remove the base plate, and then this will be attached to the router's base. Just sort of doing this in real time so you can actually get a sense of how simple and easy it is. And these holes are obviously drilled in my jig here, but if you're wanting to lay out some holes in a little jig you have, often you can just use the base plate, put that over a piece. You can put circles where the holes are, and then drill holes that way.
There are a couple questions if you want to take them now, Rob.
Sure.
What direction do you move the rotor when cutting a circle? Push away from you or pull towards you?
You will essentially do it the same way, but it's hard to explain. So one thing, multiple passes, right? You'd never go through something like a 3/4 inch piece of material in one pass. Multiple, use a potentially a plunge router. You could use a standard fixed base router, a little bit trickier though. And you want to, how will I explain this? You want to machine it so the bit doesn't grab the material and pull it towards you, right? I guess you would say if the workpiece is stationary and you have the jig screwed down in the center, I would move it again to the left. That would be, sorry, from the left to the right. That would be counterclockwise. You may, even I make the mistake sometimes, to be honest, and the router just starts to go faster than you want it, and you realize quickly, oh, that's the wrong way. It doesn't like that. So, but if you're cutting a small amount, even if you did climb cut, there'd be less of a problem. It's especially a problem when you're climb cutting and you're taking off a large cut. That's when things do get ugly. Another question about the circle.
Okay. How do you use a jig for increasing or decreasing diameters?
I'm not quite sure what they mean. Are we talking about maybe making it like a 16th of an inch less, or basically, if you want a different diameter, you have to drill a different hole in the jig, right? So, I've got these holes in here now, and when I drilled this one, and I thought, oh shoot, actually I should make that about a what's that, about a 3/16 less. So I drilled this one, which is a little bit closer to where the bit is. That's really, you probably could make something that was quite, had some sort of a dial that brings the router in just slightly or back, or even some sort of strip along here that moves it in slightly so you could fine tune it. But that's quite a more complex jig. I find just re-drilling another hole just a little bit farther, a little bit closer. Though I'm not quite sure that was the question that was
And
asked.
we can come back if he adds any more, but
Sure.
that's it.
So I have back to our edge trimming jig here. Let this guy in. So as you can see, I've set this up. Well, sorry, I've made the jig so that there is some space between the bit and the fence. It doesn't have to be that much. To be honest, the fence could come a little bit closer, but it shouldn't ever go past that bit, because then it's going to be hard for the bit to fully cover that edge as you sheen it. And in theory, what we're doing here is we're setting the bottom of the bit so that it will be perfectly flush with the underside of that jig. Easier said than done, but I usually start by making sure the bit is not touching the table when the base of the jig is down, and then keeping that surface down flat on your work surface, lowering it until you touch just barely, and then bringing it up. And hopefully that works. It's rarely perfect, to be honest, but so I can go right past it and I can see there's about I'm going to say that's a 64th of an inch gap, which is actually perfect. Last thing you want is for the bit to be slightly higher than that, than the edge of the ruler, because that means the bit will be digging into the core. Now, I would always practice this on another piece. Another way you can practice it is just on a piece of flat material. Have it flat, turn it on, and make sure that when you move it, it's not digging into the wood. So I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to grab my headphones and the clamp here. With a larger piece, you don't need to clamp this, but with a smaller piece like this, last thing I want is Make it fly. So because we're moving very slight amounts here, the direction isn't as important. You will find that in some cases you'll get a little bit of chipping if you go one way on the outside because the bit is spinning towards the outside. But if you reverse the direction, the bit will be cutting in, and the core will actually provide some support for that edge. Just use your eyes and look at what's happening. You may find if you go the other way, it's a little bit smoother. So I'm going to cut about 3/4 of the way down here, and then I'm going to stop and show you what we do with the corners here. Okay. So I think this is actually the best that I've ever set this up. First time, it is perfect. It's honestly perfect. I'm almost disappointed because it's troubleshooting this is an important skill, right? If you find any kind of grooving into the core, if the bit's set too deep, right, then you want to raise it up a little bit. And what you want is for it to be as close as perfect as possible. So just a little bit of sanding will even that out nicely. Now, as you can imagine, setting the depth of a bit and adjusting it by 128th of an inch isn't easy, right? You can use the depth stop and try your best, but it's not easy. What I find that works quite well, if you are set a little bit too deep, you can take a line of masking tape and put it right down that front edge there. Now what that does is it just raises the bit. So what I've done now is just tilt the router ever so slightly and raise that bit up a little bit. And that may be, if you were really close, this may now be perfect, right? You might even need 2 pieces of tape. But really, when in doubt, I'd rather take off not enough material than to gouge into the core and take off too much material. So I mentioned the corners. Long, straight edges are really no problem, but the tricky part is when you get to the corner. Take that tape off. For once, I don't need it. Usually what I'll do is actually machine as much as I can, but as you're going along, you'll realize that the jig bumps into the other edge. So you can only get within a few inches or so of the corners. So at that point, you have to turn the jig sideways and work into that corner a little bit more. And the tricky thing is that as you do that, there's less and less of the surface on your workpiece, and there's a chance that if you're not pressing down properly, there's a chance the bit is going to, the whole router is going to shift a little bit, immediately digging into your workpiece, very likely ruining it. So not only at the corners, but all the way along, do your very best to make sure that doesn't happen, right? You could even make a larger base plate that came up further, maybe even with a handle on it, so you can push down here. I find that the only downside to that is if you were machining a smaller piece like this, the base is so large, it can't get between all of the edges, right? So that's why I have a few. I have ones that are large like this, giving more support. I have a weird shaped one. I can't even remember why I made that. I think it was to get into a sort of a triangular joint, but they're so easy to make. I mean, I've got about three down on my rotor table here as well. Um, so, you know, I would say the wider bit that you use will make it so you don't have to have that router in a perfectly straight line as you're machining that. Yeah, I don't know if there's any questions about that one, Jen.
No questions, but I did get some more info from Gordon about his question. So he said not for a circle, but for a shape that is changing diameter.
Oh, so like an elliptical shape of sorts. Well, yeah, you can definitely do it. It's just a matter of you need a different jig, um, or you can have a pattern. Then you were talking about template routing, which is a whole new topic, really. If I had an extra 15 minutes, we could talk about that, but we are coming up close to our end here. So
Okay. What was the bit that you were just using? Someone's asking.
that was just a straight bit. Built here, probably about a 5/8 inch diameter straight bit. Nothing fancy.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
So the last one I was going to talk about is a mortising jig. Really simple. If you've ever seen people cut mortises, there's a lot of ways to do them. I'm going to say this way might be the simplest, but the challenge is I'm going to go over there. So give me 30 seconds to set this up, and you might want to close your eyes so you don't get seasick here. I've got to move this around a little bit. I've got a quick tour of the shop as well. Much easier with a phone in the shops are great. Yeah, phone in the tripod. Okay, we're at the table saw here. Okay, that's about good right there. So this is one of my longer circle cutting jigs. Rudder goes on that end. You never have too many circle cutting jigs. Okay, sorry about that. So a mortise, as I'm sure many of you know, is just a groove into the wood that a tenon will fit into. Tenon's not too hard to make, but the mortise, it's a little bit trickier. So I'm going to make it with a template guide. This just screws to the base of your router. And what we need is a notch in this that will capture all of these are all different sizes, right? This one's 1 inch outside diameter. As you can see about there, hard to see, but it's about 1 inch outside diameter. So I need a notch in here that's 1 inch wide by at least the length of the mortise that I want. So as you can imagine, I'm gonna do a couple of plunge cuts with my table saw. And it's imperative that you're not a 32nd of an inch too big, too small. It really does have to be very, very accurately machined. And making a plunge cut can be dangerous if you do it wrong. Always have a piece against the brick fence here, supported properly at the back. But I'm going to make a couple plunge cuts, and then we're going to test how wide we are. I'll admit I am rushing here a little bit, so I just hope I didn't make this too narrow. Let's say about 15/16. That's what I was aiming for. So I didn't move it over 1 inch. I moved it over 1 inch less the width of my blade, minus a little bit more. So we need to come over about a 16th of an inch more. So I am about 64th of an inch too small. Not a problem. Before I go too much further, I'm going to. No, I should take that last little bit out. Well, let's assume for simplicity's sake that I've dialed that in perfectly. I can even take my jigsaw, notch this out so that I can fit that in there and really figure that out nicely. Um, to take this out, I it's possible to turn this and do another two plunge cuts to get your length of your mortise. You do run the risk of having this piece coming loose after the fourth cut and flying around the shop. I usually take a jigsaw. Doesn't have to be perfect. You'll never see the mortise. Well, you'll likely never see. Wait, you'll likely never see the mortise, but you have to do this depending on how long the cut is, right? So I'm just going to do this sort of quickly and roughly. Piece has now been removed. Now, between you and me, that looks like the dog's breakfast, but that's fine because it's just a jig. This isn't the finished work piece. So right now, we have a look at that. Slides in there nicely, and it will almost, it's snug enough so that it will almost stay in there, but it will still slide up and down that groove. So I would show you me machining a mortise, but we're pretty much out of time here. So what happens is this is the router's base plate. The the guide gets attached to it, and you can, whether you clamp this to your piece, your work piece, and machine your mortise in many passes as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, or you can also put on different pieces on the underside, right? If you had a long piece going here, then you could take some sort of rail and clamp it to that long piece and machine the mortise in the edge of that piece. You could even take a longer piece with a straight edge going off it like so that when you put the end of a piece and clamped it to that long assembly, you could machine a mortise in the end of that piece. It's the sky's the limit here. You can even write angled mortises, just clamping this down, right? That's all it is. So um, that's that's going to beat most big mortise and tenon jigs that you either pay hundreds of dollars for or you spend days in the shop making. and you saw how fast that was. Not too bad. So, any questions? Send me a message. Always happy to chat. Thanks, everybody.